Middle podcast, the podcast dedicated to the music, movies, and culture of Generation X.
What is up, slackers? It is time for another episode of the Stuck in the Middle podcast. I am your host, Jason Eck. And one of the most frequent topics, or at least something that goes along with many of the topics, was my time growing up in Connecticut. There is something else that is not uniquely Connecticut per se, but something that still persists to this day in pop culture. And growing up in Connecticut, you could not escape this singular phenomenon, which was professional wrestling, and more specifically, the World Wrestling Federation. So the World Wrestling Federation is known for being really in New York. It's called New York, but the actual headquarters is in Stamford, Connecticut. And of course, just by proximity and relationships, New York, Connecticut, basically Vince McMahon Sr. and Vince McMahon Jr. or Vincent Kennedy McMahon could get their product, their syndicated product in particular, onto any local television station, including with sponsorships, ad revenue, etc. So I grew up inundated in wrestling country. Now, as we'll talk about a little bit, there are, well, back then it was called the territory days, where the United States of America was basically broken up into individual territories where individual promoters had their reign. It could be a few states, it could be an entire region of the South or the Pacific Northwest, what have you. However, the World Wrestling Federation was looking to go national. Now, really, when this started to happen, I was little, so I shouldn't say little, but before the national expansion happened, my only, I guess, real exposure to pro wrestling was my mom had this boyfriend, total douchebag. However, his dad had the old wrestling magazines, what's sometimes referred to as the dirt sheets. And I'm not sure how old I was, 5, 6 years old, something like that. And I see these magazines laying on the table. And on the cover, the pictures are kind of a mixture of color and black and white. But black and white, I think, was used because these pictures were very bloody. These were pictures of guys like the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes, the Nature Boy, Ric Flair, Terry Funk, Abdullah the Butcher. And they would put these pictures in black and white because it was so gruesome and so graphic. And that was my first exposure to pro wrestling. I didn't really know what it was. All I knew is there were these guys and they were beating each other up and they were drenched in blood. Okay. So fast forward. The national expansion is starting to occur. So sometime around 1985, there's this big, huge event, and it is being advertised everywhere. And I even recall people who weren't necessarily these big wrestling fans really interested in this thing called WrestleMania, which took place in 1985 at Madison Square Garden. And this was this huge deal because it was, one, being nationally broadcast. They were doing what was called closed circuit TV, where you could go down to an arena or a bar or whatever, and it would be closed circuit broadcast. The precursor of what we now know as pay-per-view. Now, I did not see this event. All I knew is it was this big, huge deal. And it was Hulk Hogan and Mr. T. Now, Mr. T was as big a star at that time as you can imagine, coming off of, or maybe around the same time as Rocky and the A-Team, and he has this rough and tumble look, and who else had a mohawk and all the gold? Mr. T ended up with his own cereal. This guy was an icon. He is an icon. And it was this huge deal that this mainstream star was going to be in this wrestling match with Roddy Piper, Hot Rod. You might know him from John Carpenter's They Live. And Paul Orndorff, Mr. Wonderful. So all these guys, they look like $1 million. They sell out Madison Square Garden. I couldn't tell you, exactly how many were in there. I think at the time, though, what does Madison Square Garden fit? 20, 30,000 people? And it was being broadcast nationally. So around the same time, so 1985, one of the things that is so stereotypical of the era is the Saturday morning cartoon. So wouldn't you know it, they also had to have a cartoon. Hulk Hogan's Rockin' Wrestling, an animated version, and they're telling all these silly stories, but also, in some ways, giving more background to some of the characters in a slapsticky kind of way. At the time, Andre the Giant was the biggest, happiest, babyface, good guy, gentle giant, much more aligned with the character that he played in Princess Bride. But nevertheless, what I'm getting at is the WWF was now making inroads across territories, which at the time was considered a little untoward because you had groups like the National Wrestling Alliance, the NWA, who were kind of governing bodies for all these different areas, and they were seeing their territory infringed upon. However, WWF wasn't the only company trying to go national. So the NWA itself was now starting to go ahead and coalesce their individual territories, trying to make it more of a, not centralized, but they're trying to build it as a national entity, National Wrestling Alliance, with cable television. So it's also this interesting thing. So the WWF, and to this day, they're on USA Network, had a very close relationship with USA Network going all the way back, all those years ago. Whereas the NWA had a relationship with TBS, in part with Georgia Championship Wrestling, etc. So you also had out in the Midwest, the AWA, so the American Wrestling Alliance, which was Vern Gagne's group. So all of these companies are starting to do these bigger events. So along the same time as WrestleMania, you also had, before that, Starrcade. And Starrcade was the NWA's big production. That was their version of WrestleMania before there was WrestleMania. So that's why people will say that Starrcade is the granddaddy of them all. And usually your headliners and something like that, it's going to be Harley Race, or Terry Funk, or Ric Flair, or Dusty Rhodes. And out in the AWA territory, where Hulk Hogan started, by the way, trying to think who would have been, their top guy at the time. I guess it's Bockwinkel, Nick Bockwinkel, who was champion for a very long time. But you had these three major companies and plus all these smaller territories all throughout the country. So I'm a kid. I end up falling in love with tag team wrestling. I think the first team that I really was they're my team. So sometime in 1987, there was a tag team called Strikeforce, which was Tito Santana and Rick Martel. And they had opponents like Demolition and the Hart Foundation and the British Bulldogs. I mean, the British Bulldogs were a huge phenomenon because they always came down to the ring with their dog. Forgetting Matilda the Bulldog. And it's this big, huge spectacle and these larger-than-life characters. And yes, spoiler alert, I was a kid. I absolutely thought, this is all real, man. Of course I did. That's part of the fun. I feel bad that nowadays kids are so aware of the fact that it's just a form of entertainment. They're basically actors. They're basically live stuntmen. But I begin to watch, as I get a little bit older, I'm watching it differently. I'm watching it from the perspective of someone who was once, yes, Hulk Hogan, He's the best. But Macho Man, oh yeah. Macho Man, when he was the heel, was much more appealing. And he had Miss Elizabeth. And then I wanted to start seeing Hogan get beaten. And then Mr. Perfect comes in, and Mr. Perfect's coming out of the AWA, and he's a heel, but man, he's really freaking good in the ring, and he's doing things that no one else was doing. And he was almost just as big as Hogan, right? Hogan was always fighting these big behemoths, but then he had to fight these really strong wrestlers, these good guys. Good bad guys. Technically proficient bad guys, like the Bret Harts, etc. Now, I have almost no exposure to any other wrestling. So as I mentioned, we did not get cable right away. And even when we got cable, sometimes it was based upon which company that you owned, or where you got your service from, or where you were located geographically. So I didn't have TBS. So I didn't even know other things were happening at this point. It was just WWF. And I remember going to one of my good friends on Saturday mornings when I would go and visit my grandparents, Jamie Lane. He lived down the street, and we would watch wrestling, mostly the tag team guys. And this was my youth. But as I said, I was starting to kind of turn to the dark side. I started getting interested in the heels. The bad guys were more interesting. They always say the Joker is far more interesting than Batman, right? I think in any art form, any media, that's often the case. The villain, if you're telling the story properly, are the most interesting. And in pro wrestling, one of the things that makes a great heel great is that they really kind of just tell the truth in their promos. So that's what it's called, the promos, when they're going out to speak. And there's always this shred of truth, but it's a little bit twisted, but it's never actually a lie. It's never really dishonest. It just is what it is. So Hulk Hogan, he's the big hero, and then he gets beaten by the Ultimate Warrior. And that was like a big deal. It was the passing of the torch. Hulk Hogan's going to go off to Hollywood, and he's going to do movies like No Holds Barred and The Tooth Fairy and The Babysitter Tutu. I have no idea. So all the younger guys who have worked all over the place are starting to become the big stars at this time. And this is when I started hanging out with people like I've mentioned on the podcast, or have had on the podcast, like Carlos. And Carlos had this WWF video game. And it was at this time that I became a huge fan, like I mentioned, of Mr. Perfect, but of Shawn Michaels, all the heels. I always wanted to play those guys because I always thought that they were the best actual wrestlers, the best technicians, the most interesting. So we moved, I'm trying to remember what year. I guess it was like 88. So I think it was 88. And my mom and stepdad get married. We have the house. We move to another part of town. We have cable. And I'm flipping through the channels after school one day. And I turn on what was really a burgeoning network called ESPN. Now, ESPN played territory wrestling, specifically Texas-based wrestling. Now, I'd mentioned earlier about the blood and seeing all that. Well, Dusty Rhodes, he's a Texan, cut his teeth in Texas, but also in Florida Championship Wrestling. This was the home of the Funks. And Terry Funk already at this time was beginning to make forays into Japan, doing what are called death matches. If you don't know what a death match is, feel free, go look one up. There'll be barbed wire and things exploding and violence, pure violence and carnage. And here you have Terry Funk, a second generation wrestler, supremely talented technician who's doing these crazy matches in Japan because, hell, it's a great paycheck. But most of the Texas wrestling that was being broadcast on ESPN at that time was World Class Championship Wrestling, WCCW. And this emanated from the world famous Sportatorium in Dallas, Texas. And you had guys like the Von Erichs. A tragic family, but supremely talented and the most popular wrestlers in the area. And their main villains were the dastardly Fabulous Freebirds, and they were led by Michael P.S. Hayes. And they had one of the first theme songs that was performed by one of the wrestlers as they went down to the ring, which was Bad Street USA. So that is just an interesting shift, because they were all coming out to music that nowadays would be given the equivalent of a copyright strike, and it was right on ESPN. You know, Kerry Von Erich, I think he came out to Modern Day Warrior by Rush? I forget exactly the different songs that people came out to, but I was like, wow, this is some harder hitting stuff. And there were a lot of younger guys, or at least where I perceived to be younger guys. So I'm like, wow, what is this Texas wrestling? Now, one of the biggest baby faces down there, baby faces are the good guys, is this guy named Gentleman Chris Adams. Now, babyface in the ring and on TV, for all intents and purposes, known as a loathsome and terrible human being outside of the ring. However, he was considered to be one of the best trainers anywhere in the world. And he's a British gentleman, and he is in Texas, and he is their trainer. So if you want to go ahead and break into the business, you go down and you wrestle with Gentleman Chris Adams, and he can get you into the Texas promotions. So there's WCCW, there's the USWA. Is the USWA out of Texas? Or is USWA out of Memphis? Anyway, I still think this is all world-class championship wrestling. And he has this guy who's big dude, long blonde hair, jacked to the gills, looks like $1 million, and he's a rookie. He's a rookie by the name of Stunning Steve Austin. Now, I mentioned that I was starting to see things with a more critical eye. I'm like, this guy looks like a star, and he's been wrestling 6 months, maybe a year. And he has this big feud with his trainer because young Steve has gone heel because he no longer wants to be in the shadow of his trainer. And on top of it all, steals the man's wife, both in storyline and in real life. But you saw it in these early days and watching Texas wrestling. Yeah, I think what happened is World Class ended up merging with another promotion, and they became the USWA. And I think that is where I was first exposed to a guy named Eric Embry. Now, anyone who remembers Texas wrestling will know that Eric Embry had been both a babyface and a heel, but I believe he was the guy who unified the companies under the new banner. I'm fairly certain that's the case. Yeah, that's the case. So he was best known for championship wrestling from Florida. He probably knew Dusty. World Class Championship Wrestling, and then the United States Wrestling Association, the USWA, when those two linked. And I think they got linked under Jerry Jarrett. That's a link back to Memphis. And we're not even going to talk about Memphis because I didn't watch it much as a kid, but that's Jerry the King Lawler's territory along with the Jarretts. So I'm watching, essentially, WWF, which is your mainstream product, and I'm watching this Texas wrestling. Now, somewhere along this time, when WCCW and USWA folds, a new company ends up moving into the Sportatorium. That is GWF, the Global Wrestling Federation, because the WWF is World Wrestling Federation. They are global, world global. Not the same thing, but the implication is they're a worldwide promotion, not just a national promotion. They were not. It was a nice idea. But there were a number of young wrestlers that worked out of the GWF who ultimately became big superstars. And this is the first time I saw this kid named Scotty Anthony. Now, Scotty Anthony was this arrogant, cocky, rich kid from Palm Beach. And he was the Palm Beach heartthrob. And his finishing maneuver was a pile driver called the Palm Beach Head Throb. I'm sorry. That's brilliant. I'm like, that's my heel guy. That's my guy right there. Big fan of Scotty Anthony, who it turns out when I looked at one of the magazines on the shelf, used to be known as Scotty the Body up in the Pacific Northwest with Roddy Piper and Gordon Soley, legendary announcer Gordon Soley. And I'm hooked. I'm hooked. I'm all in. This is the most fun for me. So thankfully there were a few friends in high school who were also watching WWF, and we would get some of the pay-per-views together. I remember watching the first Royal Rumble and the first Survivor Series and the first SummerSlam. And these were just big events, and we all got together. And, that time we were younger teens, but, we weren't partiers. And it was like, okay, 2 liters of Coke and popcorn and snacks, and you watch the matches. And it was a lot of fun. So I couldn't tell you what year, but at some point, the cable package got upgraded. Oh, actually, you know what? Back up a little bit. Before the cable changed for us where we were in Meriden, I remember going to an Easter dinner with my girlfriend at the time to her family from Bristol, Connecticut. We get done with the meal, you know how you're always full and you're just kind of, I'm just going to go sit down. I'm like, hey, can I turn on the TV? They're like, yeah, sure, go ahead. I go and I turn on the TV, and they have TBS. Now, I knew, again, probably from the magazines on the shelf, that they had wrestling. They had the NWA, or it might have even, at that point, already been World Championship Wrestling. Not WCCW, but WCW. Or at the very least, it was still Georgia Championship Wrestling. And I turned on TBS, and I don't know if it was a replay or, I think it was a replay of something called Wrestle War. Now, this is 1989. This is 1989. And aside from a few commercials late at night that you would see where you could get pay-per-views of the NWA, which, by the way, I didn't get pay-per-views at my own home. That wasn't something that was ever even thought about. I don't think I ever even asked if I could get a pay-per-view. I just assumed the answer would be no. Like $30 to watch a wrestling event wasn't going to happen. But it was my only exposure with these commercials and the magazines for this whole other world and this whole other cast of characters. So I turn on the TV, and I don't know if it was 6:05, but it's famous for a 6:05 start time, and where I think it was a replay of this Wrestle War, which was the third of a trilogy with Ric Flair and arguably the greatest babyface of all time, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. And all of these matches are rated 5 stars or above. Again, this is a subjective rating system by a guy named Dave Meltzer, who has the Wrestling Observer newsletter. Anyone who knows wrestling, they know Dave Meltzer. So these are legendary matches, considered by many, or if not most, the best trilogy, best series ever performed anywhere in wrestling. I think the only thing that's comparable is something in the late 2000s, which is Kenny Omega and Kazuchika Okada out of New Japan Pro Wrestling. So I'm watching this, and the match is over. It's grueling, and Ric Flair, the heel, but also respected, because he's Ric frickin' Flair. I'm not going to do the woo because my voice doesn't go that high. The match is over. It's grueling. I think it was more than an hour, and he's all brutalized and he's exhausted. And they did it with a judging system, so more like UFC, right? So you had to have judges. And one of the judges was Terry Funk, who after this, now he's a babyface, he's an announcer, he attacks Ric Flair. He beats the crap out of him, then pile drives him through a table. I'm sitting there with my jaw agape going, what is this? This is amazing. So now I have something else to seek out, something else to look for. Because what I began to realize about myself, even back then, so we've had the podcast where talked about music, talked about independent music and underground music and going to the punk shows and the hardcore shows and being interested in things that were not the mainstream. I'm a Mr. Bungle fan, for God's sake. I was seeking out anything that wasn't WWF, because that was foisted upon me by geography. That is what I was fed, what I was supposed to have, and it was national. And these are big stars. But it was ultimately becoming less interesting to me. So we finally got TBS at the house, and I would watch Worldwide, and they ended up getting a lot of the stars from the WWF and repackaging them in different ways. And you also had former governor Jesse the Body Ventura, who had been an announcer in WWF, who had now gone to WCW, and I heard his voice. I'm like, this is awesome. And I was just hooked on all this other stuff. Now, I still watch the WWF. I mean, they had great talent. They had guys like Razor Ramon and Bret Hart, and at the time they had a guy Diesel and Shawn Michaels, Mr. Perfect, you know, all those guys that I mentioned earlier. But now they've gone from being kind of the opening act, if you will. Not really. These aren't mid-card guys either. They're up in the main event, you know, and they're a little bit younger. They're more interesting, more hip. But I'm still way more interested in all this other stuff that's happening. But as I mentioned, girlfriend. I just, at this point, found myself watching less regularly. Like, I was fascinated by it. If I got home from school, I was going to put it on. But now, I started going to her house after school more often as it becomes more serious. And then I start driving, and you got to have gas money, right? So I got to work. I'd already been working anyway since I was 14, but I used to have this huge pull list down at the local comic shop, you know, Sam's Comics. I don't even know how many I got per week, but it was some absurd amount. And back then, comic books, what, 75 cents, $1, $1.25 tops, probably? Well, think about how much gas you could get for that. I'm dating, I'm working, I'm driving, hanging out with people, want to have my freedom. Different priorities. So my comic book draw list got smaller and smaller and smaller. And the amount of time I spent watching wrestling got smaller and smaller and smaller. And just my interests then were more music. Music was my passion. Music was what I really enjoyed. That's what I wanted to do with free time. It was my hobby. I would rather drive around and just listen to music for hours than do anything else. So kind of stopped watching wrestling for the most part. I'd say by late sophomore or junior year, I was maybe watching the big events on pay-per-view. And that was about it. But what I did know was I was always more interested whenever I can get my eyes on something other than WWF. So fast forward. When I'm 19, I move out of the house. Wasn't watching wrestling then. I don't even think we had cable, the apartment that I had. Came back for a hot minute and then moved to Boston. Moved to Boston, working, partying, paying my own way. Wasn't going to college yet. Just worked a lot, partied a lot. That's what I did. Wasn't watching wrestling. One day, I just turned on the TV, and it's one of the Saturday morning programs, and I end up seeing that guy that I mentioned from the GWF, Scotty Anthony, who is now in the WWF as a manager named Johnny Polo, complete with a polo mallet or stick, whatever they call it, over his shoulder. And it was so shticky and over-the-top characters. And I'm like, this is the same stuff that it was when I was watching it years ago. It's still the same thing. Who is this for? Well, I'll tell you who it's for. It's for kids. That's when I first got hooked. So along with the natural maturation process and having different interests, etc., you had an industry that was still very much catered towards young children. Why? They sell tons of action figures and toys and merchandise of all different types and clothes and teddy bears and the big foam fingers and all that stuff. Merchandise. And I just turned it off. I'm like, oh, just awful. I'm not interested. So maybe a year or two goes by. Probably about a year. I'm going to say, well, gosh, no. So graduated in 92. I think I watched SummerSlam 92. Probably didn't watch much of anything 93, 94. So I want to say 1996. I'm going to say 1996. So some years have passed since I watched it with any regularity. And I go through bouts of insomnia, and I'm kind of a night owl anyway. And I'm clicking through the channels. I just remember my girlfriend at the time, she was asleep. I'm clicking through, I'm wide awake. And I don't even think we had full cable. It might have been like one of those limited packages where you got all the local things. And for whatever reason, I'm going through, and channel 27 in Boston is a Spanish language channel. So I wasn't expecting to hear English coming from channel 27. And it's a wrestling show. And it's poorly lit. And it looks very strange. And who do I see in the middle of the ring but some dude with long curly hair, and he's wearing a collar, like a dog collar or a Native American style collar, and a leather jacket. And I think he's wearing a Sandman t-shirt or maybe a Nirvana t-shirt, something like that. Something grungy. And he's got a flannel tied around his waist, and he's wearing jean shorts and what look to be, well, they're wrestling boots, but they're made to look kind of like combat boots. And I'm like, what is this? And he starts talking, cutting a promo, and I'm like, wait a minute. That is Scotty Anthony. That's Johnny Polo. He was also known as Johnny Flamingo and Scotty the Body, right? I'm like, what is happening here? Except now he's known as Raven. And Raven is misanthropic and angry and depressed and grungy. He's the Gen X superstar, for lack of a better term. And he is a heel, and he has a very adult storyline, a number of adult storylines really throughout the time, one of which lasted for 2 years, where the other guy, a guy named Tommy Dreamer, never won for 2 years straight. And that is how you build an ultimate babyface underdog. But the next thing you know, there are weapons in the ring. There's canes, and there's tables, and there's chairs, and out comes Terry Funk. And Terry Funk is out there brawling, and wait a minute, that's a guy called Cactus Jack. Cactus Jack was in WCCW and USWA, and didn't he go to Japan and do death matches? Didn't he have his ear torn off in Germany? This guy's insane. He's missing all of his teeth in front. This was ECW, Extreme Championship Wrestling, out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And this was a spectacle. And all of the music that's interspersed, like these fast cuts and edits with the Pulp Fiction, you know, the, gosh, I'm going to say Jim Johnson, the surf rock. I think it is Jim Johnson, right? All the surf rock stuff. Right out of Pulp Fiction. It was called the Pulp Fiction sections. And this was violent and brutal. And the crowd was bloodthirsty. And the women were scantily clad, but they were also fighting. And the guys were pile driving the women. And it was the most insane thing. Yet, in the midst of all this, you had some really great athleticism, some great performers, and people doing things that, frankly, I had never seen before. Like this. Now, this is something I could sink my teeth into. And what I realized, the appeal of ECW, was every kid like me, when they were 9, 10, 11, early teens, who were interested in pro wrestling, were now in their early 20s, in a very different stage of their lives, in a very, I guess, society is always changing, but this was that cynical post grunge. This is post Kurt. Kurt Cobain had already died at this point. It's a different world. It's a different world completely in that part of the 90s. And ECW was everything you could possibly imagine. So if you ever watch the early ECW stuff, it is bonkers. And I don't know how they got away with it, frankly. Things that today, I don't think you can get away with it. But what I do know is that the other major companies, now at this point, the AWA was long gone. They didn't make it. They couldn't compete. Most of the territories had dried up, either bought by Vince McMahon or they folded. The NWA was a shadow of itself. In fact, when ECW first started, all the title defenses, all the titles that they carried were NWA titles, like a licensing, a branding, if you will. And when they became too big to need that anymore, they literally threw the NWA title away. Disrespectful to be sure, but that was right in line with ECW's whole ethic. So there's very little left. The NWA also lost their relationship with Ted Turner, billionaire Ted Turner, who acquired WCW. So WCW was on TBS, like I mentioned, but also TNT, their sister program, or their sister station, sister network, and the WWF still had some syndication, but for the most part, their major product was on the USA Network, as always. But they were taking notice of this little upstart company out of Philadelphia, and they found it interesting. So I turned on the TV. That's right, we did not have cable when I first saw ECW, but then we did get cable, and on TBS, I'm like, oh, WCW has a Monday night show now. Because at this point, I still wanted nothing to do with WWF. I was over it. I was done with it. I wanted anything but that. And they announced that, and coming up on Sunday at the pay-per-view, blah, 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 it's going to be the Steiner Brothers versus the Outsiders, Hall and Nash. You know, Outsiders, Hall and Nash. What boring names are those? Scott Hall and Kevin Nash. Like, those are just dudes' names. You know, he's Hulk Hogan. That's a cool name. And Rick and Scott Steiner and the Steiner brothers. That's, Steiner's not actually their real names. Rex Steiner. And Sting, original tag team partner of the Ultimate Warrior. He was their equivalent. And Lex Luger. These are cool names, but Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, the Outsiders. I'm like, oh, whatever. Turns out, Kevin Nash was that guy Diesel that I had mentioned that had been in WWF, and Scott Hall was Razor Ramon in the WWF, and they were now in WCW as Invaders. Like, that was the storyline. It was Invaders. They were invading. Now, because back then, it was a fine line between what was real, what wasn't, something called kayfabe, which is when you're, keeping it within storyline. And they were blurring the lines of whether these two guys still worked for the WWF and they were literally invading the competitor. But they said they had a third man. Remember, Bobby the Brain Heenan, the legendary Bobby the Brain Heenan. Who is the third man? Well, it turns out, and I would assume because they'd had their eye on this edgier product down in Philly, the third man ended up being the guy who was known as the ultimate babyface, the guy who was known to have put the entire wrestling industry on his back and brought it to the mainstream. The biggest bad guy was now the former American hero, Hulk Hogan. And the hate and what they call heat in the wrestling business was tangible when that happened. Now, I didn't watch that pay-per-view because, again, I still wasn't watching pay-per-views, and they did a replay of it. And so, again, this is 1996. there is just garbage being thrown at them from all corners of the arena. Like real hate, like real anger that the true American hero Hulk Hogan was a heel. This, along with ECW, was this huge shift in the wrestling industry to now attract the guys like me who were either in college or college age, who had a sense of nostalgia, as we all do, but really legitimately loved wrestling when we were younger. This gave us a product that was more age appropriate. It was more violent. The language was very, very coarse, particularly in ECW. Everything was allowed there. F-bombs, everything. Along with the ultra-violence. And then the big hero who would be battling this new group. So Hulk Hogan, Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, they were the New World Order, the NWO. If you have lived anywhere in the world in the past, 30 years, you've seen an NWO shirt. You've seen one. It was the biggest thing in the world for now. And it was a phenomenon, and it was being played literally at hip and cool places in Boston. Bars were putting it on for people to watch because people were interested in watching pro wrestling on Monday nights. So they decide that the NWO needs to have a great enemy, like a hero to fight them on behalf of WCW. So there's this guy, Sting, I mentioned. He always had a blonde hair, spiked up on top, cool makeup, bright colors, more akin to, Hulk Hogan in his heyday, yellows and bright colors. He comes back with long black hair, long overcoat, and he is rocking face paint like Brandon Lee's The Crow, which also is kind of iconic for the time period. The movie itself is iconic in part because of Brandon Lee's tragic death in filming it and what a killer performance it was. So he's dressed as the avenging angel, if you will, Crow Sting, as he was known. These are all iconic things that were huge shifts in creativity and presentation that was appropriate for the era. Now, I'm still not watching WWF. But, I'm picking up the dirt sheets and also the very early internet. The very early internet where dirt sheets were going online and there were fan forums, etc. Remember how I said down in the USWA or World Class Championship Wrestling, there was some big guy, blonde hair, stole a man's wife? That's right. Stunning Steve Austin. He was Stunning Steve in the NWA/WCW for a little bit, had some success. But now he has truly found himself. And he is Stone Cold Steve Austin. I'm sure you've heard that name, even if you're not a wrestling fan. Stone Cold Steve Austin. And his major nemesis was some other guy. You might have heard of him. I don't know. He's been in some movies. What is his name? Oh, yeah. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. Rocky Maivia. These two guys are the best guys on a microphone that you can imagine. But I'm still not watching it. It's just, I'm just kind of like, no, I'm not going to watch that company. I'm over it. And Stone Cold's even bigger nemesis, the great big bad, if you will, little Dusty Rhodes, was Vince McMahon himself, the owner of the company. So they're telling this story in WWF that I'm not paying attention to, which is one of the most relatable stories in all of media, which is the guy who tells his boss to F off. The guy who fights the company. The guy who takes no prisoners. The guy who is a vulgar, beer-swilling Texan who has never changed from the time that he was a heel. Only difference is whose ass he's kicking. And this really resonated with fans. But again, I'm still not watching it. And The Rock went from being this terrible, super cheesy babyface that everyone hated to a guy who is part comedian, part ass kicker. He was definitely becoming the performer that we all know Dwayne Johnson to be. But I'm happy over here. I'm watching ECW, I'm watching WCW. But there's a guy who had been in ECW that I mentioned named Cactus Jack, Mick Foley. So Cactus Jack, hardcore wrestler in Japan, violent, and even back in the WCCW days, would do things with his body that the announcer would go, he is damaging his body just as much as his opponent, because he would literally throw his body at his opponent. Now, he was in a faction with Raven, two of the best talkers and minds in the history of the business. And his whole gimmick, the whole time that he's in ECW as a heel, now this is a place that embraces hardcore violence. Like, that's what the crowd is there for. He did everything but hardcore matches. He would go and pick up a chair like he's going to swing it, like he's going to do something hardcore, and he would put it down because he hates hardcore. He's anti-hardcore. So this is brilliant. He's cutting these killer promos, and Vince McMahon sees him, and he brings him up, and he puts him in a mask, and he makes him the Undertaker's biggest enemy, but he's behind a mask, and he's called Mankind. And his catchphrase is, "Have a nice day!" So I'm not interested in that. I'm like, you've ruined Cactus Jack. How come he's not Cactus Jack? What the hell is a Mankind? And his ring gear is brown, and he's wearing a brown leather mask. Like, I get the concept of the character, but it was stupid. But I did respect the guy. I respected Cactus Jack and who he had been on the indies and elsewhere. So there is a fateful moment in wrestling history where what we know is the pro wrestling business today, which is for the most part, there are multiple companies, including big companies and actual, competition to what is now WWE, because they lost to the Panda. Still the weirdest loss ever. Anyway, what had been happening was WCW was beating WWF in the ratings for 83 consecutive weeks. Okay? 83 consecutive weeks. And that's a considerable amount of time. That hurts from not only a ratings perspective, but advertising dollars. The product is getting edgier, so already your advertisers are like, I'm not sure what this is, and if I want to be associated with it. So ECW is still on the syndicated circuit at this point. They haven't gotten network yet. They did eventually get network on TNN. But they're hemorrhaging money. And there are many times where the talk is, we might have to go bankrupt. WWF might close, might go out of business. So they were taping shows. So they would go and they would tape and they would get 2 episodes. They record all one night, sometimes here in Lowell, at the Lowell Memorial Auditorium, a fairly modest sized building where they would record Monday Night Raw. But because they were taping, the endings were already known by people who were in the building. And you know who else knows that information? The competition. So on this fateful night, and I don't know what night it was. Again, I don't do deep research. My apologies. Someday, if this thing takes off and I have staff, I'm going to say, okay, guys, let's do research. I need to know dates, times, years, people, all of it. But that was probably I don't know, because they do things from ratings about, quarter hours, half hours, and they break it down that way into different segments. So your ad spots are in different places. You can move them around, but you have to have a certain number of ads per hour. It's just basically how it works. And I think they were coming up to the top of the hour because it was about to be the main event on Raw. And that was Mick Foley, known as Mankind at this time. So Mankind versus The Rock for the WWF Championship. This is kind of a big deal, right? Except the announcers for WCW, thinking that they're knocking them or taking the piss out of them, say, oh, haha, over on the other channel, they're about to put the title on Mick Foley. Haha. Oh, that'll put asses in the seats. And in that moment, people like me, who are Cactus Jack fans from way back in the day and have always respected the man and anyone who'd watched Japanese wrestling, even on a passing basis, it was something like 1 million people changed the channel all at once. So instead of watching your main event, while true, it is live, never been aired before, that taped product had also never been aired before. So even though you're going to give away the ending, what an ending. People want to see that. And we all switched the channel. And it was in that moment that 3 major characters ended up, well, 4 really, I think were all in the vicinity of the ring. And that was Stone Cold Steve Austin, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, Mick Foley, and Vincent Kennedy McMahon. And that was a tremendous amount of star power, all in one place. And was ultimately the death knell for WCW. Now, it didn't happen for another year and a half, but it completely changed. Again, it changed the paradigm in the business. It moved everything. So once again, the WWF became the predominant national product. And they ended up buying out WCW for some absurdly low dollar amount. Like absurdly low dollar amount. When there were other companies that were willing to bid 2, 3, 4, 5 times what the WWF paid for the product. Their main competitor. And remember I mentioned that ECW had ended up getting cable on TNN? It had been one of their better rated programs. However, there had been some scuttlebutt in the industry that the USA Network was looking to change their branding and change the programming that they were going to have, right? Now, this is also part of what was happening at TBS and TNT. We're going to do drama. We're going to do more serious stuff. We don't want to have wrestling on our TV anymore. So that's why Vince was able to get it for cheap money, because they weren't, even if someone else bought it, they weren't going to run it on their network. They were going to be more sophisticated. Because again, the 90s is a crazy time, crazy place, right? Well, all these established networks wanted to get original programming. They wanted to get, I think, Emmy Awards and industry awards. And these heathens, these barbarians in tights are bringing down the IQ of our viewership. So TNN knew this, and they said, hey, your contract with the USA is going to be up. And yeah, we have a really short contract with, an out clause and renewal clause with this ECW. And, they're interesting and all. They're a little much, honestly. But, how would you feel about coming over here instead? So not only does Vince end up buying WCW for a song, he gets ECW essentially kicked off their network. He then ends up buying their assets out of bankruptcy for no money. So now he has all the intellectual property, all the physical property, and all of the tape libraries of, I think, the AWA, WCW, ECW. I think he has all of World Class Championship Wrestling, USWA. I think he carries some of the Memphis stuff because Jerry Lawler still works for the WWF or WWE. I think he has pretty much every major promotions tape library, which is why they had the WWE Network, which then they've now sold all of that off to Peacock. So now NBC has this huge tape library of basically the history of professional wrestling. I guess I just wanted to share that kind of wrestling journey of Gen X, from rock and wrestling and Saturday morning cartoons and foam fingers and the plush little wrestling buddy dolls and action figures, to when we were young in our 20s and hitting the bars and watching wrestling and watching it become this very adult, somewhat risque, and certainly full of violence and debauchery, probably much more aligned with those magazines that I saw when I was a kid, with all that blood and guts and violence. It comes in waves, but I think that these are particularly interesting eras in wrestling that many of us, even if you're no longer a wrestling fan, can look back on with some nostalgia and some affection. I think everyone remembers seeing Hulk Hogan in Rocky, and seeing Mr. T in Rocky, and then seeing him in the ring. I mentioned Roddy Piper being in They Live, which is honestly iconic. Keith David, that fight scene. Awesome stuff. Andre the Giant in The Princess Bride. Jesse Ventura in Predator. I ain't got time to bleed. It's terrible Jesse. He has this interesting tenor in his voice, but he was in Running Man and Major Star. And then you look at The Rock coming out of that whole era and becoming the highest paid and one of the most bankable actors in Hollywood, because the main thing about wrestling that I've gotten throughout all these years, they're comedians, they're stuntmen, they're legitimately athletes. They could be angry, it could be serious, it could be violent, it could be silly. It could be just about anything that you want it to be, because it is much more like a minstrel show or a variety show, which is why when people kind of poo-poo it or scoff at it, I'm like, well, what you're scoffing at it for is kind of what it is. And that's okay. That's what makes it fun. That's what makes it stupid. That's what makes it enjoyable. I don't know about you. With the exception of a couple of movies, Adam Sandler movies are not known for being particularly deep. Guess what? I love Adam Sandler movies. Not all of them. Some of them are even too stupid for me. But let me tell you, if you're the kind of person who doesn't think that Billy Madison is freaking hysterical, I don't know what to tell you. But it doesn't have to be serious. Hot Shots. That was so much stupid fun. Didn't need to be serious. Or just anything that has comedy. Anything that doesn't take itself too seriously, I think is a worthwhile art form. This was the dive from the rock and wrestling era to the attitude era and all points in between. I hope you enjoyed this little stroll down Wrestling Memory Lane. What I'd love for you to do is to head over to Facebook and follow me at Stuck in the Middle of Gen X Podcast. You can also follow me on Instagram and Twitter and YouTube at StuckPodX. You can email me at stuckinthemiddlepod@yahoo.com. And most importantly, and I do ask you to please leave 5-star reviews, like, and most importantly, subscribe to the podcast. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please share it with friends, family, neighbors, anyone you think might enjoy the content. Because the more the podcast grows in listenership, the more opportunity I will have to create more content. So, until next time, later, Slackers.